It always struck me as cruel how John May's dog probably knew what was coming before May did. The dog could smell it, the way animals can smell fear and blood and death approaching on a cold morning. But May, he just kept working on that truck axle in the garage at 2122 North Clark Street, his hands black with grease, his breath making little clouds in the February air. He had Highball leashed to the truck bumper, like he always did when he worked. The dog was lying there quiet, ears up, watching. And that's how Highball became the only innocent witness to the most famous gangland slaying in American history. The thing about John May was that he never should have been there at all. He wasn't a gangster. Not really. He was a mechanic. He was 35 years old. He had a wife. He had 7 children to feed. 7. And in 1929 in Chicago, when you had 7 mouths crying for food, and the only people hiring were the bootleggers and the rum runners and the North Side gang, you didn't ask too many questions about whose Cadillac you were fixing or whose truck you were working under. You just took the work. You took the money. You went home. I need you to come in Thursday morning. Bugs Moran had told him. Or maybe it was one of Moran's men who told him. The sources conflict on this. What we know for sure is that John May was told to be at the SMC Cartage Company garage at 10:30 in the morning on February 14th, 1929. There was a truck that needed work. There was a meeting scheduled. There was a shipment of hijacked Canadian whiskey coming in. Good stuff. The kind that could make a man a lot of money during Prohibition, when a barrel of beer cost $4 to produce and sold for $55 to a speakeasy. May brought Highball with him like he always did. The dog was a German shepherd, though in 1929, they weren't calling them that. They were calling them Alsatian wolf dogs. The name German shepherd had fallen out of favor after the Great War. Same way sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage and Frankfurters became hot dogs. The British didn't reinstate the original term until 1977. But Highball didn't care what you called his breed. He just wanted to be near his owner. So May leashed him to the truck axle and got to work. The other 6 men in the garage that morning were waiting too. They were different from May. They were real gangsters. Peter Gussenberg, 41 years old. Enforcer. Killer. He had done things that kept him awake at night, though he never talked about them. Frank Gussenberg, 37. Peter's younger brother. Also an enforcer. The 2 of them had tried to kill Jack Machine Gun McGurn once, missed, and now everyone knew there would be payback. Albert Kachelek, 42. He went by the name James Clark. He was Bugs Moran's second in command and his brother-in-law. When you married into Moran's family, you married into his gang. Adam Heyer, 40. Business manager. The guy who kept the books, who knew where all the money went, who paid off the cops and the judges and the aldermen. Albert Weinshank, 36. He managed the cleaning and dyeing operations that Moran used as fronts. He looked like Bugs Moran. Same height, same build, same overcoat. From a distance, you could mistake one for the other. Reinhard Schwimmer, 29. He was an optician. He liked hanging around with criminals because it made him feel dangerous. He wasn't in the gang. He just wanted to pretend he was. And then there was John May under a truck with his dog. Highball was probably the only one who heard the Cadillac pull up outside. Dogs hear things humans miss. The crunch of tires on snow, the opening of car doors, the footsteps approaching. 4 men walked into the garage. 2 of them were wearing Chicago Police Department uniforms. The other 2 wore civilian clothes, long overcoats, fedoras pulled low. The 7 men inside the garage looked up. Police? One of the uniforms said. Line up against the wall. This was routine. This happened all the time. The cops would come in, rough everybody up a little, maybe take some cash, maybe confiscate a case or 2 of whiskey for themselves, then leave. You paid the bribe. You walked away. Nobody got hurt. So the 7 men lined up against the back wall of the garage, shoulder to shoulder, hands raised or hands in pockets. Nobody too worried because this was just cops being cops. Highball started barking. One of the men told him to shut up, or maybe nobody told him anything. Maybe the dog just kept barking, frantic now, pulling at his leash, because he could smell what was about to happen. The 4 men raised their weapons. 2 Thompson submachine guns. A shotgun. Maybe a revolver. The sources conflict on that detail, too. And then they opened fire. The sound in that enclosed space must have been unbelievable. The Thompsons fired 45 caliber rounds at a rate of 600 rounds per minute. The walls were brick and wood. The bullets tore through clothing and flesh and bone and embedded themselves in the brick. The casings hit the concrete floor, making a sound like rain on a tin roof. The muzzle flashes lit up the garage in strobe bursts of white light. Highball went out of his mind. John May, still under the truck when the shooting started, tried to crawl out or tried to stay hidden or tried to shield himself with his arms. It didn't matter. The bullets found him anyway. The whole thing took maybe 90 seconds, maybe less. When the shooting stopped, the 4 men walked out. The 2 in civilian clothes put their hands up. The 2 in police uniforms marched them out at gunpoint, making it look like an arrest. Anyone watching from across the street would have seen cops doing their job. The Cadillac drove away. Inside the garage, smoke hung in the air. The smell was gunpowder and blood and voided bowels. The back wall was covered in bullet holes and blood spatter. 7 men lay dead or dying on the concrete floor. And Highball, still leashed to the truck, started howling. The dog howled and howled and howled. The sound carried out of the garage, into the cold air, across the street, into the neighboring buildings. It was a sound that people who heard it never forgot, a sound of pure animal grief. "I heard this terrible howling," one neighbor said later. "I thought maybe a dog got hit by a car. But it just kept going. It didn't stop." At 10:40, a neighbor named Jeanette Landisman called the police. "Something's wrong," she said. "There's a dog howling in that garage and it won't stop." The first officers arrived at 10:45. They walked into the garage and found what would become the most photographed crime scene of the decade. 6 men were clearly dead. The 7th, Frank Gussenberg, was still breathing. "What happened?" the officers asked him. "Who did this?" Gussenberg, with 22 bullets in his body, refused to answer. Or he said, "Police did it," referring to the uniforms the shooters had worn. Or he said, "I ain't no copper," which was gangster code for "I don't talk to cops even when I'm dying." The sources conflict. What we know for sure is that he didn't give up any names. They rushed him to Election Brothers Hospital. He died 3 hours later at 1:30 in the afternoon. Highball was still howling when the police arrived. One officer tried to approach the dog. Highball lunged at him, teeth bared, protecting his dead owner even though John May was beyond protection. "Get that dog out of here," someone said. This is where the story gets contradictory. This is where the truth fragments into competing versions, the way truth always does after a massacre. One version comes from Cook County Coroner Herman Bundesen. In his records, the dog's name was Fritz, not Highball. The dog belonged to Albert Weinshank, not John May. But Bundesen was processing 7 bodies in a city-wide panic that day. Maybe he got the details wrong. Maybe someone gave him bad information. Maybe it didn't matter to him whose dog it was. Another version comes from photographer Russell V. Ham, who arrived at the scene with his camera. Years later, in a letter to John Faber, a historian with the National Press Photographers Association, Ham wrote that Highball was locked in the cab of the truck, not chained to the axle. He wrote that the dog was raving mad. He wrote that the dog had to be destroyed. As for Hack Miller, Ham wrote, meaning his fellow photographer John Hack Miller, he did not take the so-called poopy home. The dog was raving mad and was destroyed. But Hack Miller told a different story. "I got the police dog," Miller said. "I had him for a couple of years. Then they stole him back from me." Who stole the dog back? From where? Miller never said. But the story has a certain Chicago logic to it. Maybe Miller took Highball home because he felt sorry for the animal. Maybe someone in John May's family came looking for the dog later. Maybe there was an argument, a confrontation, a theft in the night. Or maybe Miller was lying. Maybe he wanted to be part of the story. Photographers do that sometimes. They insert themselves into history. Most historians side with Ham. They believe Highball was so traumatized by what he witnessed that morning that he had to be put down. A dog that sees his owner murdered. A dog that howls for hours over a corpse. A A dog that lunges at every person who tries to approach him. That's a dog whose mind is broken. That's a dog you can't save. But we don't know for sure. The records don't say. The police reports don't mention what happened to the animal. There's no official documentation of his fate. What we do know is that Highball was there. He saw everything. He smelled everything. He heard every shot, every scream, every body hitting the floor. He was the only witness who could have told us what happened. And he couldn't talk. The massacre made headlines across the world. 7 men executed in a garage on Valentine's Day in broad daylight, in the middle of Chicago. It was the kind of violence that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be explained away, couldn't be blamed on bad luck or wrong place, wrong time. It was calculated. It was professional. It was a message. Everyone knew who sent the message. Al Capone, the South Side boss who'd been fighting with Bugs Moran's North Side gang for control of the bootlegging trade, the speakeasies, the gambling dens, the brothels. Capone had been trying to kill Moran for years. And on February 14th, he thought he'd succeeded. He thought the man in the garage who looked like Moran, the one with the same build and the same coat, was Moran himself. But Moran wasn't there. He was running late. He saw the police car outside the garage and kept walking. If he'd been on time, he would have died too. Only Capone kills like that, Moran said afterward, breaking the code of silence that Frank Gussenberg had upheld. But even with Moran naming names, nobody could prove anything. Capone was in Florida when the massacre happened. He had an alibi. He had lawyers. He had cops on his payroll and judges in his pocket. The massacre was never officially solved. Not in 1929. Not ever. The investigation went on for months. The police found a Cadillac used in the shooting. It had been stolen. They found 2 Thompson submachine guns in the home of a suspect named Fred Killer Burke. Ballistics tests proved those guns had been used in the massacre. They also proved those same guns had been used to kill Frankie Yale in Brooklyn a year before. But Fred Burke disappeared. He fled to Michigan, killed a cop there, got caught, went to prison, and died in 1940 without ever being charged for the Valentine's Day massacre. Other suspects were named: John Scalise, Albert Anselmi, Jack Machine Gun McGurn. All of them had motives. All of them worked for Capone. All of them were killers. Scalise and Anselmi were beaten to death with a baseball bat at a banquet thrown by Capone himself a few months after the massacre. Some say it was because they were planning to kill Capone. Some say it was because they botched the hit on Moran. Either way, they died before they could be charged. McGurn had an alibi. He was with his girlfriend at a hotel when the massacre happened. The girlfriend, Louise Rolfe, became known as the Blonde Alibi because she testified that she and McGurn were together all morning. The cops didn't believe her, but they couldn't break her story. McGurn was murdered 7 years later on February 14th, 1936, shot to death in a bowling alley. Someone left a Valentine card next to his body. The card had a poem on it. You've lost your job, you've lost your dough, your jewels and handsome houses. But things could be worse, you know. At least you haven't lost your trousers. The massacre changed Chicago. It embarrassed the city. It made the violence impossible to ignore. Civic leaders who looked the other way during the bootlegging wars suddenly couldn't pretend everything was fine. The feds got involved. Elliot Ness and his untouchables started raiding Capone's breweries. The IRS started looking at Capone's finances. Within 3 years, Capone was in prison for tax evasion. 11 years and a $50,000 fine. He served 7.5 years in federal prison in Atlanta, then at Alcatraz. When he got out, his mind was destroyed by syphilis. He died in 1947, a broken man who couldn't remember half the things he'd done. Bugs Moran kept running the North Side gang for a while, but his power was finished. The massacre had killed his best men, his brother-in-law, his business manager, his top enforcers. Without them, he couldn't compete. By the mid-1930s, he was out of the bootlegging business entirely. He ended up in Ohio, pulling small-time bank robberies. He died in federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas, in 1957. Lung cancer. He was 63. The garage at 2122 North Clark Street became a tourist attraction. People came from all over the world to stand outside and take pictures. They'd look at the building and imagine the blood, the bullets, the bodies. They'd ask to see the bullet holes in the back wall. In 1967, the building was demolished, but before it came down, a Canadian businessman named George Patey bought the bricks from the back wall, the ones with the bullet holes. He numbered each brick, dismantled the wall, and shipped it to Canada. He rebuilt the wall in the men's room of a nightclub he owned called the Banjo Palace. Later, he moved the wall to the lobby. But weird things started happening. The nightclub had bad luck. Employees quit. People said the wall was cursed. Patey eventually broke up the wall and started selling the bricks individually. He sold them for $1,000 each. Some people who bought the bricks reported strange occurrences, nightmares, accidents, financial problems. They returned the bricks or threw them away. Today, nobody knows where all the bricks ended up. Some are in museums. Some are in private collections. The Mob Museum in Las Vegas has a section of the wall on display. It's one of their most popular exhibits. The bullet holes are still there. You can put your finger in them. The garage itself, the space where it used to stand, is now a fenced-off lot with few trees. There's no marker, no plaque, nothing to tell you that this is where 7 men died and a dog howled himself hoarse trying to wake his owner from death. John May's widow and 7 children were left with nothing, no pension, no insurance, no compensation, just a mechanic's salary that stopped the day he got killed. The North Side gang didn't take care of their families the way the Italians did. If you died working for Moran, your family was on their own. There's no record of what happened to Mrs. May and the children. They disappear from history after the massacre. Maybe they moved away from Chicago. Maybe they changed their name. Maybe they just wanted to forget. And Highball, if he survived those first hours, if he wasn't put down immediately, if Hack Miller really did take him home for a couple years like he claimed, what was his life like after that day? Did he flinch at loud noises? Did he refuse to go into garages? Did he bark at strangers in long coats? Did he have nightmares the way dogs sometimes do, twitching and whimpering in their sleep? Or did he forget the way animals sometimes forget trauma if they're given enough time and enough safety? We'll never know. What we do know is that on February 14th, 1929, Highball saw something no dog should see. He saw men walk into a building and shoot his owner and 6 other men to death. He saw the blood and the bodies. He heard the shots. He smelled the gunpowder and the fear. And then he howled. That howl is what brought the police. That howl is what turned the scene into a crime scene instead of just an empty garage with 7 corpses that might not have been discovered for hours. That howl is what made Highball, for one terrible morning, the most important witness in Chicago. But a dog can't testify. A dog can't identify shooters. A dog can't tell you who drove the Cadillac or who gave the order or who stood outside keeping watch while the killing happened inside. All a dog can do is howl. And so the massacre went unsolved. The killers went unpunished. Capone died rich and famous and free, at least in the sense that he wasn't in prison when he died. Moran died poor and forgotten in a federal cell. The 7 victims were buried and mourned and then gradually forgotten, except as names in a history book, footnotes to a gangster story. Only Highball, leashed to a truck axle or locked in a cab, watching everything, unable to do anything, became something more than a footnote. He became a symbol, the innocent bystander, the pure witness, the dog who loved his owner and lost him and mourned him and couldn't save him. Too well loved to ever be forgotten, Meyer Lansky had inscribed on his dog's grave marker years later in Miami. Nobody inscribed anything for Highball. There's no grave that we know of, no marker, no memorial, but we remember him anyway. Nearly 100 years later, we remember the dog who howled in the garage on Valentine's Day, trying to wake the dead. There's a photograph of Highball that survived. It shows a German shepherd, ears up, alert, strong-looking. He's staring at the camera with the intensity that shepherds have, that focus. In the photograph, he looks like he's waiting for a command, waiting to be useful, waiting to protect someone. But there was nobody left to protect. The SMC Cartage Company garage had a false front. The sign in the window said it was a cartage company, a trucking operation, something legitimate. But everyone in the neighborhood knew what it really was. It was a gang headquarters, a place where hijack whiskey was stored, a place where deals were made and territory was divided and orders were given. John May probably told his wife it was just a garage, just auto work, nothing dangerous. And maybe he believed it himself. Maybe he thought that as long as he stayed under the trucks, kept his head down, kept his mouth shut, he'd be fine. He wasn't in the gang. He was just a mechanic. Nobody shoots the mechanic, except when they do, except when you're in the wrong place at the wrong time and you look up from your work and see four men walking with guns and you realize, too late, that you should have quit this job months ago. May had probably thought about quitting. Most men in his position thought about it. But with 7 children and a wife and rent to pay and mouths to feed, where was he going to find another job that paid as well? This was Chicago in 1929. This was Prohibition. If you weren't working for the bootleggers or the gangsters or the corrupt cops, you were probably unemployed. So you took the work. You ignored the warning signs. You convinced yourself it was temporary. You told yourself you quit after you saved up enough money, after the kids were older, after things got better. And then one morning 4 men walk into your garage, and you're dead before you can even stand up. That's how it happened to John May. That's how it happens to a lot of men who tell themselves they're not really criminals. They're just working for criminals, which is different, which is safer, which is something they can walk away from whenever they want, until they can't. Highball couldn't have known any of this. He couldn't have understood the politics or the territory wars or the grudges that led to that morning. All he knew was that men came in with guns, and his owner died, and he was alone. Dogs don't understand betrayal or ambition or revenge. They only understand pack and loyalty and the people who feed them and scratch their ears and leash them to truck axles because they don't want a dog running out into the street. When May died, Highball lost his entire world. The photographs from the crime scene are hard to look at. They show the 7 bodies sprawled on the floor, the blood pooled around them, the bullet holes in the wall. One photograph shows Highball, still leashed, standing near the truck, looking at the camera with an expression that's impossible to read. Is it confusion? Grief? Fear? Dogs' faces don't show emotion the way human faces do. You can't tell what they're thinking, but you can hear what they sound like when they howl. And every witness who was there that day remembered the howling. It's in all the police reports, all the news stories, all the accounts from neighbors and passersby. That dog wouldn't stop, one witness said. Even after the police came, even after they took the bodies out, the dog just kept howling. It was the saddest sound I ever heard. Maybe that's why people remember Highball. Not because he was important to the case. Not because his presence changed anything about the investigation, or the trial, or the verdict. He wasn't important in that way. But he was important in another way. He was the grief that everyone else felt but couldn't express. He was the innocence that got destroyed that morning along with 7 lives. He was a reminder that this wasn't just a gangster story, wasn't just a mob hit, wasn't just business as usual in Chicago. It was a massacre, a slaughter, an execution of 7 human beings who woke up that morning thinking they'd be alive at the end of it, and one dog who went to work with his owner and watched him die. If Highball really was put down, if the trauma really was too much for him to recover from, then he became the 8th victim of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The only one who didn't have a funeral. The only one who didn't get a gravestone. The only one whose name appears in history books as a footnote, if it appears at all. But maybe that's appropriate. Maybe that's the right way to remember him. Not as a victim, but as a witness. Not as a casualty, but as a survivor, at least for a few hours or a few years or however long he lived after that morning. Because witnesses matter, even when they can't testify, even when they can't speak, even when all they can do is howl. That howl echoed through Chicago that day. It echoed through the newspapers and the investigations and the trials. It echoed through the decades, every time someone told the story of the Valentine's Day Massacre. And it echoes still, nearly 100 years later, in a fenced-off lot where a garage used to stand, where 7 men died, where a dog tried to wake the dead and couldn't. The crime scene photographs are archived now in museums and universities and private collections. The bullet-riddled bricks are scattered across the world. The Thompson submachine guns that fired those bullets are in glass cases, labeled and cataloged, and studied by forensic historians. The bodies of the 7 victims are buried in cemeteries around Chicago. The killers are all dead, murdered, or imprisoned, or rotted by disease. But somewhere in those archives, in those photographs, you can still see Highball, leashed to a truck, staring at the camera, waiting for his owner to get up, waiting for someone to unclip his leash, waiting for the world to make sense again. It never did. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre changed organized crime in America. It was too public, too brutal, too shocking to ignore. It forced law enforcement to take the mob seriously. It forced newspapers to stop glamorizing gangsters. It forced politicians to stop pretending the violence wasn't happening. But it didn't stop the violence. It just made people more careful about where and when and how they killed each other. The garage came down. The gang wars moved on. Prohibition ended. New criminals replaced the old ones. New massacres replaced the old headlines. And a dog named Highball, who saw it all happen, who couldn't stop it or change it or testify about it, disappeared into history. Or maybe he didn't disappear. Maybe he's still there, in that empty lot where the garage used to be. Maybe if you stand there on a quiet morning in February, when the snow is falling and the air is cold and the city is just waking up, you can still hear him, howling for the dead, howling for his owner, howling for all the innocent witnesses who see terrible things and can't do anything but cry out and hope someone hears. Highball was just a dog. He didn't understand politics or crime or revenge. He didn't know who Al Capone was or what Bugs Moran had done or why men kill each other over whiskey and territory and pride. All he knew was that his owner was dead, and so he howled. And because he howled, we remember. We remember the massacre. We remember the 7 men. We remember the violence and the bloodshed and the way an entire city changed on a single morning. But most of all, we remember the dog. The only truly innocent victim of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The only witness who couldn't lie, who couldn't be bought, who couldn't betray anyone. The only witness who told the truth, the only way he knew how, by howling at death until someone came to listen.